Thank you. So for the next speaker, shortly before lunch, I've had the honor of introducing someone who's going to be speaking to you about cybersecurity, supply chain, and ERM solutions. As you heard this morning, he's been newly appointed as the Chief Strategy Officer of CyberX. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Leung.
Hello, everybody. So yes, I'll be talking about ERM approach to supply chain cybersecurity assessments. So why this is of interest to me, I find this to be the most complicated or complex and challenging aspect of a security program. And as you can see, some of the stats there, organizations are actually really struggling with this area. So I find it challenging in regards to that. The parts of organizations that are struggling with it is basically how best to assess the risk with your third parties and their suppliers. Is it too little, too much, and somewhere in between? They don't know, and they spend either a lot of time and effort at that. And as you can see, there's very little confidence in regards to their approaches. So this I find to be quite interesting. And organizations sort of need that help. So I'm not going to be talking about tools per se to help assess this, but more on the people and the process aspects of it. So do we have any auditors in the room? No? Good. So this is a report from IIA, and this report actually helps auditors to basically set the direction as well as influence the boards and executive management in key areas. So this year's report actually highlighted 4 key areas, and the 2 top ones were cybersecurity, data protection, and third-party risks. And what you can see, this is some stats as it relates to what they report to. So 70% reputational damage is how they view reputational damage. There's a 51% lack of cybersecurity expertise, not on the cybersecurity team, but in their audit team in regards to having enough skills to be able to actually identify those risks. And with that is the gap between the actual desired state. So meaning they have a plan to actually assess this, but they don't have the efforts or capacity to actually address some of the assessments on that. More than half of auditors report that recovery plans for third parties are not based on risk, and if they do have them, as well as 30% are extremely or mostly satisfied with their organization's third-party risk management. It's only a third of that. So as brought up and discussed earlier about the IBM Ponyman report, the cost of a data breach report. So within that report, they actually outline the factors implicating or impacting the record, the cost of record breach. So what you see on the left here is actually aspects that are factors that actually reduce the cost. And on the right, you'll see that these are aspects or factors that amplify the cost of a record. So what you'll see on the bottom there, which extends out, is the third-party breach actually extends the cost and amplifies the cost of a data breach. So from a process perspective, most organizations have a vendor management and contracting process. So this is kind of typical in terms of what an organization has. So on the top layer, from a swim lane, you'll see that there's usually someone that's requesting a supplier or a third party, usually from the business. You typically have a procurement or vendor management team that manages the whole process from end to end. And then you have your subject matter experts within security to actually assess the third parties. And then you actually have the supplier, and then their suppliers as well. So what we're going to focus on is really this piece here in terms of the process. And actually, first thing is really scoping the supplier assessment. So really understanding the purpose and the goal and the value of the supplier to the organization, understanding the data types and classification of the data, and understanding the network interfaces and data flows. So as well, identifying all the relevant layers of the suppliers. So this would be system integrators. Do they have colo data centers? Do they have any software solution providers or any other X providers? Are there any third-party development as part of that process? Do they have third-party support that they rely on to provide their service? So others. So this is the other challenging part, is really identifying those other layers. And as you can see in the chart here, you have a reduced visibility in regards to that. So a lot of organizations base their approaches on a framework. A popular one is the NIST framework. Is there people that adopt this or use this within their organization? Okay. Just make a note that there's a version 1.1 came out about last year. And just to note that is that they actually added a component under supply chain and risk management. So with that, there's actually 5 areas under that. And it's really, do you have an established risk management process? Have you identified and prioritized your suppliers? Are the contracts with appropriate measures in place? Do you have an ongoing regular assessments or audits or testing that meets those obligations? And do you have a cybersecurity incident response and recovery planning and testing with those third parties? So those last two are a little bit more challenging, especially if you have a breadth of suppliers. Another common framework is the ISO framework, which really touches on a number of domains. And it's really to look within the context of the organization, looks for risk assessment and treatment, and basically this standard can be applied to most organizations of any size. And typically when you assess an organization, either your own or others, you apply a typical framework. ISO is a really good one. Another one is SOC 2, and typically these are reports that just really address the relevant security and aspects of a system and information. Type 2 reports actually provide additional sections that talk about operating effectiveness of those controls within a period of time. So typically these, when you're asking of a supplier, they will either provide some of this, or these are things that you'd be looking for. Another one is the Cloud Security Alliance. And this is also what's driving the whole third-party and looking at third-party risk, is that the adoption of cloud. So I like this framework in that it has a 3-tier. One is an assessment piece, a self-assessment that they do. There are also third-party certification that can be achieved. And then they have a third part, which is the continuous monitoring. So as you can see, the control domains are a little bit different, but they touch on different areas. So one of the challenges here, if you see, the latest version has 295 questions. I think the first version that came out, it was about 100. So typically what organizations do, they take this and give it to their suppliers. Fill it out, please. And I think it was okay in the start, but now it's up to 295 questions. I think they're getting some feedback, and now they've come up with a light version. It's not fully out yet, but it's in beta, and they reduced it down to 73 questions. So I like this framework, and I like the questionnaire. And I've actually used this to create my own questions out of this. Another one is called shared assessments. And really what this is it's a third-party risk membership program that provides organizations with a way to obtain more detailed reports. But this one's a little bit daunting in itself. It also has a questionnaire. And sometimes your third parties will actually provide you, hey, I've already filled this out, so I should be good to go. However, if you look at that, they have up to 250 all the way to 2,500 questions and responses that they could provide. And sometimes it's not really relevant. And then, as you can see, there's a different control areas that they break it down into. And here's just for reference, other questionnaires or other frameworks that are popular as well. So that being the CIS the Center for Internet Security, the NIST. Vendor Security Alliance is an interesting one that's come out as well. And there's one also for the higher education cloud vendor assessment. So, number of frameworks and so forth, just to be aware of it. So what usually happens when you're dealing with third parties is that they've done their assessments of their own selves on one of these standards, and they provide it to you. So the challenge is, how do you take those different formats, different structures, and how do you make sense of it to fit your organization's risk profile? So here's another study by Risk Recon back in 2017. Basically, the more questions you ask, the higher the cost. I like this in that it breaks it down by industry. So as you can see, the finance and insurance has a lot more questions, 283. So more than likely, they've taken one of those standards and just applied it to their aspects. And on the right there, you'll see a table that because finance has so many questions, that one analyst on average would do about 73 assessments on a vendor. And I like this, they actually break it down here to try to quantify it. So the more questions you ask, the lower cost per question. And picking up on finance again, is that on a cost per question basis, finance is actually more efficient. However, on a cost per vendor assessed, finance is inefficient relative to other sectors. So this is trying to quantify that the questions that you create or utilize actually has an impact in terms of the effort that's required. So getting back to the security questionnaires, either adopting questionnaires that are provided by some of the standards and so forth, or creating ones yourselves. The main area, the issues reside around those connection points, when you're actually sending out the request and having the supplier respond to that, and then either going back and forth. So what you want to do is reduce that effort and that complexity of understanding, of really providing them the key questions that you want to ask, and then having them respond accordingly. And what I found is a lot of those questions aren't well worded, well suited. So what you want to do is really look at those questions and build an approach to creating a better question. So this may seem trivial, but really, you really want to clearly outline and communicate to both internal stakeholders and third parties. And why I say internal is that they really need to know, because it's usually viewed as, oh, security's taking up, it's taking their own time, and they're actually the bottleneck. But if you explain to them why you need it, what's required, there's a better understanding of what's required. So for example, if you look at what is required, you can put this as part of the questionnaire or the form that you send out. Whom should be involved? Usually, you're either dealing with a salesperson that's trying to respond to it, or someone who's not necessarily the subject matter expert. And likewise, they may be not the ones that to be able to answer it from their third parties. So you want to make sure that they are aware to contact the fourth parties, fifth parties that are involved in their solution. And again, why is it involved? Why it's required? And I think the key thing here is number 4, is the impact. So really articulating, if you don't have this information, it's actually going to delay the process. And again, this is why you want to reduce that back and forth between the supplier and your team that's actually assessing it. So how to respond, or how you want them to respond. So when you create those questionnaires, you probably want to align it with the control domains. Pick either one, ISO, the CSA, or one of the other ones mentioned before. Allow for degrees of yes. And what I mean by that is a lot of the questionnaires are just yes, no. So why not have them answer in degrees of yes? So allow for commentary. Why? Explain a little bit. And structure it something similar to this. Are people familiar with the OSFI cybersecurity self-assessment? No? Oh, 1 to 2. So what I've done is just created something very similar, adopted that. I like how they structured their degrees of yes. One could look at a maturity model, but I find that structuring it this way, in terms of fully, largely, partially, allows to understand themselves, extending it to their third parties and their fourth parties. And then along with that, actually getting them to provide supporting documentation. Again, stating that up front is very useful. So having a high-level network diagram data flow will actually give you an understanding of who they're talking to and how that flows with their fourth parties. And if it's not accurate enough, that's what you want to make sure that they outline that as well. Are there any independent audit certification reports that can be submitted? Do they have a security policy and applicable, but not do they have it? Show me evidence of it. What does it look like? Some other key ones, obviously, a vulnerability management policy process, patch management process, and also evidence. Show me the last ones that you've done in the last 6 months, 3 months. Evidence of the latest penetration tests. Do they have a business continuity disaster recovery plan? How does that integrate? How does that integrate with your processes? So those are things that you want to outline and have them articulate that, or have them work with you to develop that. Okay, so now you have all this information. You have the responses from the supplier and their third parties. You have some evidence. So what do you want to do? So you want to apply at this review stage of really assessing this information, identify and analyze it. So this is where some of the risk management aspects come into play. So you want to identify some ERM categories applicable to your organization. Some of the common ones, you've got strategic risk, reputational risk, financial, operational, compliance. On the bottom, compliance could fall into legal and regulatory. You may identify one for employee risks. Hugh had a big diagram yesterday that sort of outlined what his organization has outlined already. And with that, you want to work to develop some measures, some tolerances. What's considered very high as it relates to financial loss? Put some numbers to it. What is it between very low? So you've got some quantitative measures, and then here's an example of a qualitative measure from a reputational perspective. So do you have an issue or an incident? It's very high, and that means it's sustained national industry-wide negative front-page publicity, or it's very low, minor negative publicity. And then with that, you want to understand the overall impact to the supplier's products and services would have within those categories, looking at from confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So a lot of people just look at, when they do a business impact, only from an availability perspective, because they look at it from business continuity. However, you want to ensure that these other layers are included as well when you assess that. So when you're actually defining these things, you actually want to talk with the key business people to help define those at an enterprise level. And once you've defined that, it's relatively easy to create a business impact assessment worksheet. So to keep it very simple, you take that, each confidentiality, integrity, availability should be able to fit on one page. And when you identify that, you work with the sponsor of the business to actually identify how they view it, its impact to the organization. So with that, you're actually defining what's called inherent risk of this system. And with that, you also want to classify the level of the risk of this supplier. So an example would be taking a 1 to 5 scale. 1 could be a level 5, which we classified as very high, that this risk exposure to the supplier to the organization is considered very high. And this is where you would actually spell out the specific quantitative and qualitative measures for each ERM categories. So someone could look at it on one page and define what that would look like. And the value of doing that is that once you've defined that, you can identify this supplier and it's probably third parties, its full solution. It has a high impact to the organization. I need to spend more time and focus on this. So typical risk, impact and likelihood. However, if you follow an ERM model, there's some difficulty here because they usually define likelihood based on time percentage or previous occurrences. So if you think about it, it's kind of hard to assess the likelihood of something happening. However, getting back to the questionnaire, if we define what I'm now referring to a presence of control, meaning these controls across your supply chain is fully there, largely, partially, or none at all, that helps with defining the likelihood or probability of an issue happening. So putting it all together, I mentioned I'm not going to talk about tools. There are tools that will help with this, such as a simple outline of a spreadsheet. But basically, what you're doing is getting back the responses from your supplier. Obviously, not just taking it for word, checking for evidence, following up possibly on a few questions that they had or commentary, and understand how they self-assess themselves. So you're reviewing their self-assessment. In your view, is that more or less accurate? From that, you can take the residual score of each control area, and you basically impact times presence control. And then from that, you have a risk posture. So total residual risk score, number of control area domains. Again, this one's based on ISO. They may have a different one, or you base your questionnaire on a different framework. So getting back to the actual supply chain, you've got your questionnaire responses. The supply chain looks like this in terms of what they have or don't have. And based upon the scoring mechanism of either largely, or fully, so forth, you can actually determine the overall total risk posture. So from a reporting perspective or a focus area, if one says, I'm just going to focus on level 4 and level 5, I've assessed these. Of the 205 that I've assessed at a level 4, 20 of my suppliers are identified as higher risk. So I'm going to put my focus and follow up on them. If you remember, do you do continuous or regular reviews of your suppliers? Another key aspect is if you have exceptions. Those, again, more focus and follow-up. And this is actually what you may want to articulate to the executives and outline to them. We have a number of suppliers. These ones are of higher risk. And here are the focus areas that we need to put some effort towards. Okay, so this is what I'm seeing in this space. It's changing quite a bit. We have a number of GRC and vendor risk management solution offerings. I'm seeing a lot more. Vendor management solutions are now incorporating risk assessment capabilities. However, both of those have their own methodology, and that's fine. Some of them actually can incorporate ERM principles into that, so you can actually build that into those tools. If they don't, if you like this approach, you can actually take that and translate it in terms of their high-medium scoring. I'm seeing a stronger focus on security standards, on frameworks for third parties, supply chains, a lot more certification requirements for third parties. Unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot more questions and questionnaires. So I think it's going to go up before it goes down. And I'm seeing a lot more people using and incorporating security ratings and monitoring service, and I think they add value. One of our sponsors, Security Scorecard, is one of them. BitSite was mentioned yesterday, and they actually fit into the overall risk posture profile as well. One key area that I'm seeing of interest is that a lot of companies are actually outsourcing this risk third-party assessments and using intermediaries. So some companies like CyberGSX, Vendor Security Alliance. So what this is that instead of you dealing and asking those particular vendors, is that these vendors are actually volunteering and providing that information to them, and they're, in a sense, doing their assessment and providing that value to you. So I don't know how good they work, and they have their own methodology, but what you may want to do is look into them, as well as see, and if you want to adopt an ERM approach to your organization, see what you can do to translate that information that you get back from them and how it fits into your risk profile. Great. And my talk's a little short, but I've got a lot more time, so I've got a lot of questions. Any questions? Good? Okay. Thank you.